All right, so yesterday we started looking at viruses and what viruses do, the study of viruses, virology, and how they're not necessarily a living thing, but we say that they have a life cycle. And when we talk about that, it's just their ability to reproduce, how they need a host to do so, and they're either going to do it one of two ways. They're either going to do it through the lytic cycle, which is like what happens with the flu, or even COVID-19, where it comes in and the cell just starts to reproduce that virus over and over again until the cell basically bursts from so many viruses inside. There's the lysogenic cycle, which would be things like AIDS, HIV, chickenpox. Those viruses can stay hidden or latent for a long, long time until they come out to basically wreak havoc on the body again. And then we finished off talking a little bit about vaccines, and this is kind of important for what we're talking about today. Because if you notice here on these little cells, or on these little viruses, they have like these little shapes on them. And these shapes are kind of like the identifiers that are going to allow it to go into certain cells and also just allow your body to identify it. And so what those vaccines did was they basically made specific types of antibodies that would allow your body to be able to recognize it when you got it and fight it off. And so that's the whole point behind vaccines. We're going to look a little bit deeper at some different ones today. But before we do, today's video, what it's going to be discussing is what viral diseases are and how do we control them. And so before we can really even talk about these viral diseases, including COVID-19, we have to look at where do they come from? What is a viral disease? And how is it that they can affect some people but not others? And so for that, we're going to start looking at the virus's specificity. In other words, how it specifically attacks certain parts of the body or certain organisms. And so what you need to understand is that these viruses have specific markers or antigens that will only line up with certain cells or organisms. In these cells, they kind of fit like a lock and key. Your hormones and enzymes that are inside your body are very similar. They're only going to affect certain cells. Take coronavirus, for example. All these little protrusions, these antigens on the outside that kind of look like a crown, that's what gives it its name, corona. And so, long story short, you need to understand that viruses have specific hosts. All right? The way they do this, or the way that they have these specific hosts and can't go into other places, it's just like we saw in that picture earlier. Notice how this one kind of has like these little triangles here, and then there's this place where the triangles can line up on the cell. Well, watch when this cell goes and lines up with these. It's going to slowly come over, and look, it's going to match with those, and the cell is going to grab onto those and pull it right in. Now, let's say that these were little squares on the outside. Notice these markers don't have anything to do with the square, so this cell would not be affected by this virus because of the antigens. So the antigen on the outside of the virus fits to the specific receptor on the host cell. And so here you can see that there are different types of antigens that a virus can have, and they can change. They can go into different types. But what you need to understand is, again, that's why things like COVID are going to affect the lungs, but not necessarily affect the brain or the skin. Whereas chickenpox is going to affect the skin and that skin tissue, but it's not generally going to affect your lungs. Likewise, the rabies virus, which we can get from animals from time to time, is going to affect the nervous system because the receptors that are on those neurons match up with the antigens that are on the rabies virus, and so that's why. Now, they can also be specific, and generally are specific, to species, and what I mean by that is sometimes if, let's say, well, let's just use the example we were talking about the other day with tobacco, the tobacco mosaic virus. That's a plant virus. So if you were to get that on your skin or ingest that somehow, you are not going to get, most likely, the tobacco mosaic virus. And the reason for that is because viruses are specific. They have specific hosts. In other words, it's really hard for a virus to cross species. So with that being said, even things like with other mammals, it's going to be hard. Now, some of you guys might be thinking, well, didn't this newest virus this COVID, don't they believe it came from a bat? And most likely, yes, there are bats that are carriers of this virus. But what's happened is this virus emergence. And so what happens from time to time is, if you remember when we talked about creation and evolution, we talked about genetic mutation, gene mutation, how rare it is sometimes to happen. Well, it's very rare in our cells, but in a virus, that DNA is actually mutating quite a bit, quite often, very rapidly, very fast. That's the same reason that you need a new flu shot each year, is because the virus adapts. Well, sometimes those mutations may allow the virus to enter a new host. So maybe the DNA that it's coding for example, gives it these little marker molecules. Maybe that's what the virus is. But maybe it gets mutated, and maybe a couple A's and T's and C's and G's uh, get mixed up somewhere, and they go from this circular marker to now the DNA is going to code for triangular markers. And so now this virus that was affecting, let's say, the bat, is now going to affect, let's say, a human. That's how these viruses spread and become new viruses that we have to worry about, like COVID. And so that's why we call them emerging viruses, because they're emerging out of nowhere in a sense, or they're emerging from someplace new. And COVID isn't the only one. The reason we call it swine flu is because it came from pigs. Same with the avian bird flu, even HIV. Uh, Scientists have done studies with the HIV virus and looking at it with very similar viruses that are found in chimps, and it's believed that most likely the way that we got HIV into the human population was through people eating infected chimpanzee meat that had this virus, or this mutated version of the chimp virus that could actually affect humans. If it was a virus that the chimp had that couldn't affect humans, the body would just get rid of the virus. But somehow HIV was able to affect the humans and therefore spread the virus. And that's what's happened with all these different animals. And so those are the emerging viruses. So what is a viral disease then? In your textbook, the section that you guys read yesterday talked about viral diseases and how we combat them. But it did a very poor job at really explaining what a viral disease is. Probably because the book thinks that's kind of self-explanatory, but we're going to go ahead and look at it. So first of all, a disease is defined as any disorder in an organism's structure or function. What I mean by that is it's going to be abnormal in the structure or function. In other words, when we are seeing these different things happening, like let's say chickenpox here or shingles, right? Your body should not normally break out in a rash. And so because something's happening to the body that doesn't normally happen, it's called a disease. Now, there are different types of diseases. There are diseases that are genetic, where it's something that you're born with that just happens, or it's something that you get from a virus or bacteria. But a disease is just when the body doesn't work right. Maybe something's happened to the body structure where it's not building itself properly, or maybe something's happened where it's just not working properly and you're getting sick. And so because these things aren't working the way they should, that's why we say it's a disease. And so viral just simply means the virus. And so a viral disease is any type of disease that's simply caused by a virus. So when we talk about viral diseases from here on out, that's what we're going to be discussing. That's why you hear people saying that COVID-19 is a viral disease, because of the way it affects the respiratory system. It doesn't allow the respiratory system to function properly, thus causing a disease. And so that's why people say COVID-19 is a viral disease. So how do we control these viral diseases? Well, we have several methods, and several methods that we're actually trying. Some of them aren't necessarily to stop the disease, but more so to hinder it from doing any more harm. And so some of these methods include vaccinations. And if you read in this section, there's actually two different types of vaccinations. When we talked about vaccines the other day, we talked about how Edward Jenner took the cowpox virus and he smeared that all over the scar tissue, and that supposedly worked as a vaccine. Our vaccines are a lot more complicated today, and that's a good thing because now we have things known as inactive vaccines, which are simply dead viruses, and we have attenuated vaccines, which are actually a living virus. However, both types of vaccines are important and good. So, first of all, when we say dead or live viruses, viruses aren't technically a living thing. A lot of people don't consider them a living thing. And so, when we say that, we just simply mean, is the virus active? Can it cause harm to the body? And so, a dead virus is not going to be able to do anything simply because it can't be replicated. So, somehow they've inactivated this virus where it can't go into the cell and reproduce. However, what's important with these vaccines is the fact that the virus is now in your bloodstream, which means that your body can start to develop antibodies against it. That way, every time it sees this virus pop up, it can start to destroy it. That's the whole point of the vaccine in the first place. And so, a inactive vaccine can either be where it's just the whole vaccine or the whole virus that's there and it's dead, or they can be subunit inactive vaccines, which means that we're going to break up the virus into its basic components, just chop it up in a bunch of little pieces like we put it in the blender, and then that's the vaccine. And what that does then is it still allows your body to read all these different parts of the vaccine, but it's a safer method, you could say. However, there are some issues with that. It doesn't always work, and that's why we have attenuated vaccines as well. And so attenuated vaccines are actually a live virus. And what this means is replication can work, but it's going to be weaker. And so when you have an attenuated vaccine, this vaccine will have the virus in it, and it will be a live virus. There is the possibility of you getting sick from it, but not most likely deadly sick. And so attenuated means that it's a small, weaker virus. You can kind of see here how they look like different viruses, and that's because this one was made in a lab. Again, these are all made in labs. We're not taking these out of nature to make the vaccines. The virus might be in nature, but we take that and then we genetically manipulate it to make it safe to use. And so attenuated viruses are going to be smaller ones. They could be very similar, or it could just be a smaller version of the actual virus. And again, the reason we use this is because it really helps the body build up that immunity, especially when you do get sick from it. So you may have a minor sickness from it, but what that's going to do is going to trigger that immune system to start reacting to kill off the virus. And that way it heightens your immune system even more to be prepared for the virus. So a lot of people who talk about attenuated vaccines will basically say, it's better to have a little cold when you get the virus or a little sickness compared to not getting the vaccine at all, and then when the real virus shows up, dying from it, because that's a real possibility. And so those are the two different types of vaccines that we use. I found a really nice little infographic that I'm going to link into the description that talks a little bit more about that. If you want to check it out, you can. And then the last thing that we use sometimes are antiviral drugs. Now, the drugs kind of just help when you already have the virus. Vaccines are for before. Antiviral drugs are for when you have the virus. So things like interferons. And what these interferons are, it's kind of complicated. Long story short, when you get a virus, your body's going to naturally make interferons. It's going to basically check out the DNA of these viruses, and it's going to code to make these certain types of proteins that will hinder the virus from being able to replicate inside the cell. In other words, this won't be able to reproduce inside your body because your body has made these little drugs that inhibit it from doing so. And that's the other problem with these drugs, is that our bodies do it, and so naturally, and it takes a long time to make these in the lab. So that's why, like, we have interferons for things like HIV, AIDS, and other viral diseases like that, where people have to live with it throughout their life. And so antiviral drugs simply help them to live with the symptoms, but it doesn't eradicate the virus. It just simply hinders it from being able to reproduce, making it stronger. And so these drugs are very expensive and they're not used often, but they are an option. So before we end, I just kind of want to talk about how do these viruses spread. We talked about how they can spread from species to species if it mutates, but how do we get to these proportions like we've seen this year with COVID-19? Well, first of all, it's going to either spread directly or indirectly from person to person. And when this happens, like with COVID-19, we call it a communicable disease. In other words, uh, each person uh, is coming into contact like a community, and so hence communicable diseases. This can either be through airborne, like COVID-19. COVID-19, because it's a respiratory infection, that's generally where it rests, is in the lungs. And so when you breathe out, you're breathing out a lot of those particles. That's why it's so important that you wear masks right now. Not so, it is so you don't get it when you breathe in, but it's also so when you breathe out, you're not giving it to other people. So it can be airborne. Now, generally, it's only going to go about 6 feet away. That's as far as it can go when it's in the air, simply because after about 6 feet, it starts to gravity starts to take its toll on it and it falls down to the ground. And so you can still get it past that 6 feet, but nonetheless, it's going to be harder to reach you airborne. Some of them can be through bodily fluids. If you guys remember a few years ago when we had the Ebola endemic in Africa, we were afraid of it becoming a pandemic like we've seen with COVID. And if that were the case, it would have been very dangerous because Ebola was this viral disease that affected the blood, and that was another reason it didn't spread like COVID did, was simply because of the way it spreads. It's through bodily fluids. So if you come into contact with somebody's blood who has Ebola, and then somehow that got into your body, that would then in turn give you the Ebola virus. However, because it was a lot harder to spread, it could still spread fast, but not like an airborne virus. And because of that, that was actually a saving grace of that. Others can be vectors, and when we say vectors, we're talking about things like insects that can carry this virus and then give it to you. So things like insect bites, mosquitoes, flies, ticks. Ticks aren't an insect, but nonetheless, those ticks can spread diseases like Lyme disease or malaria. Now, some of these aren't caused by viruses, but nonetheless, we can see through them how diseases can spread through these different vectors. And so that's another thing we have to watch out for. Also, ingestion, like we saw with the AIDS virus, when people were eating this chimpanzee meat, that was most likely the way that HIV got into the population, was because of that mutated virus. Likewise, with COVID-19, that's one of the prevailing theories right now, is that in the Wuhan province, or somewhere around that region, there was, in one of the wet markets, which is kind of like just a market for animals for food, somebody bought a bat, and they would eat the bat probably for like a bat soup or some type of food, and this bat most likely had this mutated coronavirus in it. And when the person who ate that bat, they were ingested with the coronavirus and thus spread it to them. And because they ate that, then they were able to spread it through the airborne ways and all the other ways that have been possible. However, for any of these to work, the virus must be contagious. It must be in a contagious state. And so you've probably heard that before too. Maybe your parents talking about it, or on the news, where they say, you're okay if you are non-contagious anymore. You may still have symptoms, but you are non-contagious and it's safe for you to go back to work. What that means is that the virus can't, if you're not contagious, the virus can't reproduce. If you are contagious, that means the virus is active and reproducing inside of you. And so the way that you know the difference, you might still be sick, but the doctor says that you aren't contagious. And the reason for this is the sickness itself was caused by the infection, by the virus. However, closer to the end of your flu or your cold, the virus has most likely already been killed off by the body. Now the body just has to recover from the virus itself, what it did with the infection. And so you may still be sick, but the virus is gone. So that's why they say you may still have symptoms, but you're not contagious because the virus has already been destroyed. Now, knowing personally when you are or are not contagious is a very difficult thing to do, especially when you can be what's considered asymptomatic, which means that you're not showing any signs of the virus. And so uh, that's again why they say that you need to isolate yourself. Which brings us to the final thing I want to talk about. How do we stop the spread? This is, I think, an extremely important topic, especially for what we're going through right now. And so that's kind of what I want to cover this with you guys. So the first thing you can do is inform yourself. Know what type of virus you're talking about. For example, talking about corona, understanding that it's an airborne virus is extremely important. That gives us information that we need to know about how we can protect ourselves from it. Things like HIV, it's important to understand how you can get that, or even Ebola. Knowing how these viruses are spread helps us better understand how to stop that spread. And so just learning a little bit about the viruses is extremely important. So that's why next week we're probably going to take a day out just to look at COVID alone. Guard yourself from it. Don't touch your face. You've heard that probably over and over again in the news, talking about wearing your mask, not touching your face. And the reason for that is because your body has very few places where diseases can actually enter and cause danger, potential danger to your body, because our skin is very protective. However, our face, we have a mouth, we have a nose, we have eyes, and in all those different areas, there are small places where the virus can actually get into our body and into the bloodstream and into the system. And that's why people say guard your face, don't touch your face, because you might have the virus on your skin and you're not getting infected from it on your skin, but if you touch your face and allow that virus into your body, there you go. And so again, don't touch your face. Next up, clean any wounds that you have. Again, our skin is very protective, but if we get a cut and then that cut gets infected, well, now it's right in your bloodstream. And so making sure that your wounds, if you have any wounds, are clean, and washing your hands. I have that underlined because that is so important. In fact, washing your hands with just normal soap and water actually kills the virus a lot better than with just using hand sanitizer. I know we're going crazy over hand sanitizer right now, but washing your hands is a whole lot more effective than uh, just the hand sanitizer, because what actually happens is the soap starts to pull apart the virus. And so, again, washing your hands. And then, last but not least, what we've been dealing with right now is self isolating and quarantine. If you get something like coronavirus that has spread exponentially, you may be forced into a quarantine. And that's what's happening right now. And the reason for it is like we see right here in this little chart. You see, if we weren't quarantining ourselves and we were allowing people to be in these large groups, remember this is a communicable disease. And so being around these people and being especially airborne, that means it could spread really fast, like we saw in China or in Italy. And so we don't want that to happen. We know a lot of people are still going to get sick from it. In fact, probably the same amount of people are going to get sick from it as would be before. However, the reason we quarantine is because of this little graph right here. So let's look at the red one first. This red graph represents the population that would be getting coronavirus if no quarantine was taken. And so your y-axis represents the amount of people, the number of cases, and your x-axis represents time. At this little point right here on our y-axis, where we see that dotted line, says healthcare system capacity. In other words, at this point, if we were to go past this point of number of people sick, we don't have enough doctors, we don't have enough staff, we don't have enough hospitals to help these people. And so while all these people under the line are getting help, that would mean that all of these people above the line can't get help and would most likely die from the virus. That's why we do quarantine. That's why we do this self-isolation, is because it helps slow the spread. And if the spread of this virus is literally spread out through time. All right, we still have the same amount of people getting infected. However, the peak takes a lot longer to get there, and look, it never goes past that capacity and then slowly starts to make its way down. Yes, it's going to take longer, but we're not going to have as many people dying from the outbreak as we would like we saw in Italy, where their peak was more like this. And so again, I know this really stinks right now, the way that we're in quarantine, can't even be in school to understand or talk about these things, but this is the reason why. And so this is why I took a little bit more time to talk about viruses this year with you guys, because I feel like it's really important for understanding what's going on right now. So that's it for this week, guys. Tomorrow is just a makeup review day. Your grades are constantly being updated, and you'll see that. And if you have any questions, let me know. You can contact me through Remind or through the YouTube live tomorrow, and I will talk to y'all later.